Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Thursday, August 19th. And on Thursdays, we turn our attention of the common good to issues that we know matter in our world. What are issues that we should concern ourselves with, issues that we might need to know more about or want to share about with others? And today, we're going to be talking about one that's a biggie. When I said to my wife, she said, "What are you talking about on the podcast today?" I said, "We're talking about ending nuclear weapons and nuclear war." And she goes, "Well, there's a big topic." And that's the kind of thing we want to wrestle with in our humanity, is what are the big topics that we can be addressing. And so today we are really excited to be talking with Tristan Guyette and Calvin Ryerse, who are both a part of a grassroots movement effort called Beyond the Bomb. Now, Tristan, really good to have you. Calvin, good to have you here. Boy, I'll tell you, a lot of people think of all the issues that matter in the world, talking about nuclear weapons and nuclear war feels like a 1980s, 1970s, 1960s issue. They're surprised often to hear that people are still talking about this, and that the need is still as high as it is, which is really disappointing, right? Because the threat of nuclear weapons feels like that's right up there with, like, climate change of really life-threatening fear that we could have in our society. So thanks for all of your work. How did you get into this, and remind us about how important all of this is? Tristan, what led you to become somebody, in your youthful age, to be worried about the issues of nuclear weapons and the destruction of the planet by nuclear war?
Yeah, it's a great question because, it's such a hopeful topic. It's really what everybody wants to work on every morning. They get up and they're like, yeah, nuclear weapons. But I had no experience in nuclear weapons or really foreign policy prior to joining Beyond the Bomb. And I think it really speaks to what you were saying about, not a lot of people talk about nuclear weapons like they are a current issue. And that's why at Beyond the Bomb, we talk about them like they're issue zero, because we think that they underlie all of these other problems that we have. Like you mentioned, climate change. If you're concerned about spending, you should be concerned about nuclear weapons. If you're concerned about Indigenous rights, you should be concerned about nuclear weapons. All of these issues. So I didn't know anything about nukes, but I saw the position open and I was reading the Beyond the Bomb website, and I thought, you know what? If they can make me, someone who cares about reproductive rights and Indigenous issues and climate change, care about nuclear weapons in 10 minutes, I think I can make other people care about nuclear weapons too. And
how long ago did that happen? When did that little recruitment of you into caring about this issue take place?
That was about 3 years ago now.
Uh-huh. And now you're the person at parties on podcasts that sits around talking about, well, in addition to that, did you know that we have some fears of nuclear weapons? I'm
a lot of fun at parties.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you find somebody, from Russia, you're like, hey, we got a lot in common. We got to figure out this whole nuclear weapon thing. All right, Calvin, how about you? How did you find yourself into this conversation of worrying about nuclear weapons?
Yeah, it's actually, I think I kind of have a unique experience because I kind of came into nuclear issues because growing up in Springdale, Arkansas, where there's the second highest Marshallese population in the world, I was always kind of aware of the kind of shadow effects that nuclear bombs have on communities, and seeing the physical effects of the radiation and the displacement and the heartache and kind of longing to return to a home that my friends literally cannot return to because of the testing the United States did in the 50s. I was kind of aware of it and around it, and came into the nuclear space really interested in working with communities that I had been a part of and have close ties to, which is different from Tristan's experience.
Now, Calvin, I would imagine there are people who wondered if they misheard or just said to themselves, I've never heard the phrase the Marshallese, and they may not even know of the peoples that come from the Marshall Islands. And those are the peoples you're referring to that were a part of a refugee group that people in Arkansas, that the state of Arkansas has a partnership to partner with Marshallese peoples. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of us don't even know that there's a series of islands that the United States used as area where they would test the implications of nuclear radiation on these people. So can you give just a few more sentences on who those peoples are and what's going on with this?
Yeah, so the Marshallese, they're an indigenous population to the Marshall Islands, and which are kind of like a small string of atolls in the Pacific Ocean, and really kind of historically, it was like a flashpoint in World War II between the United States and the Japanese, and when the United States uh, used nuclear weapons to win World War II, the kind of ownership of the islands were passed on to the United States. And in the 50s, the United States were trying to find a place to test nuclear weapons that would be as remote as possible, and kind of just, I guess they received permission the from the chief of the Marshallese, but kind of phrased it in a way that was not clear about the full intentions of the United States military.
Right.
You know,
There
to
were
say the
all
least.
kinds of things going on in the 50s where around nuclear weapons and nuclear war, no one was really clear what was going on, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
part of the
The
history of this
United
whole.
States does not have a long history of dealing fairly with indigenous populations to begin with.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, a lot of deception. And if I remember right, even back, when the military was suggesting the use of nuclear weapons then they said on military population in Japan during World War II, President Truman didn't even know all of what was going on. Like there were all kinds of issues, and we'll get to some of that about how the correction toward the issue where the president of the United States didn't know and only certain people knew what was going on coming out of this Manhattan Project. We've gone the other way where now the president of the United States, whoever is in that role, has the full authority to launch nuclear war at their command. And we even sort of mythologize the suitcase they carry around that we sort of, what I think in a scary way, call the football, as if this is some sort of a game. It's like it's a mass murder tool that you're carrying around in that suitcase. But we can get to all of that later. But this is part of what's going on. Is there's so much misunderstanding, deception, forgetfulness, and all the rest that goes on in nuclear weapons and with nuclear power. Can you talk a little bit about nuclear as a whole? First of all, how you like to pronounce it, because back in the early 2000s, when George Bush was president, it was nuclear, and I say nuclear. I think until I get my mind out. So if you have a way you like to say it, but then also, where's the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons and other nuclear sort of scientific endeavors? Where is the world on that, and where is Beyond the Bomb around those issues?
Yeah, that's quite a question right there. There's a lot in there, right? So I guess to start with nuclear power. So I will say Beyond the Bomb, we are a very small organization. We have only a handful of full-time staff. Calvin, we are lucky to have as an intern. And because we don't have unpaid interns, that means we only get Calvin for a few hours a week. But we would much rather be able to pay the people who work for us. So all of that to say, we don't so much take a stance on nuclear energy because the issue of nuclear weapons takes so much of our time. But, when it comes to issues of nuclear waste, which is produced by both, we see that those are constantly stored in unsafe ways, often in, marginalized or low income areas and communities. So the issue of nuclear waste, that runs throughout both of those topics and is something that constantly harms people to this day. So I think right now, as you've said, nuclear weapons seem like they're so far in the past, and that is how I pronounce them, by the way. They seem like they're so far in the past, but we are still spending, in 2021, this year, we're spending $1,200 every minute and a half on our nuclear arsenal.
Say that again. Say that number again so it soaks in for people.
Yep. So remember when the government decided that you were worth one $1,200 check? We had to argue with them for just a little bit more. They're spending that every minute this year on nuclear weapons. So they're still harming us, whether we ever see their use again, just the cost of them alone. But the fact of the matter is, like you said, one person has control over this arsenal, and human beings make mistakes. We make miscalculations. Not even touching on the last 4 years of mistakes and miscalculations, yelling at people on Twitter, things like that. But, everybody can make a mistake. Whether it's Joe Biden or Abraham Lincoln or George Washington, no one person should have that option.
So let's spell that out. The current situation is that in the course of military command, and correct me if there's any part of this that's not right, that the President of the United States has the authority, and is the only one who has the authority, to put on call and to launch nuclear weapons. That only the president can do that, and the president alone can do that. Now, again, there's a whole system that would have to follow that order, but the system is pretty well set up that people are going to follow that order, at least as far as I understand it. There was some little change in that. General Milley was suggesting that there were contingencies in place that from January 6th to January 20th of 2021 that they were putting in place, that Donald Trump could not launch nuclear weapons if he had said that he wanted to. They were coming up with a workaround to sort of prevent or delay that, which is just a terrifying thought that professionals in the Pentagon were having to talk about this. But is that generally right? The president has to say fire nuclear weapons, and the president can say fire nuclear weapons.
So it's interesting that General Milley told Nancy Pelosi that there were measures in place, because as far as the rest of us are aware, there are not. So if the president chooses to launch a nuclear weapon, they go to that football, which is just a briefcase. But everything in nuclear weapons has to have like a really manly name to it. So they go to the football, they look through this little black book of options, essentially, of different maneuvers. They do have to speak to the Joint Chiefs, but they don't have to listen to them. They don't have to take anything that they say seriously. And then when it comes to actually issuing that command, the president calls, they read off their list of codes. They're given a corresponding code. But essentially, it's set up so that any type of order that you receive to launch a nuclear weapon is perceived to be a lawful order. So for anyone down that chain of command to stop it would be really opposite to what the military teaches you from day one, but really unlikely too. The other issue is that oftentimes presidents have a very limited window to make that decision in. We have a ground-based strategic defense system called intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are largely based in the Midwest, but essentially they have this use it or lose it mentality. Because if we think there's an incoming strike, president has about 7 minutes to choose whether or not to launch those missiles. And the idea being, if they don't launch them, that they will be destroyed in this incoming strike. So realistically, more than likely, they're going to launch them. But what if that information was wrong? What if, any number of things happened? So it's a really terrible system with very few checks and balances, and we've managed to get by without any real incidents. We did accidentally drop a nuclear weapon on Goldsboro, North Carolina that one time, but we've gotten by the skin of our teeth, and we can only survive.
Okay, I don't know that story. What is that story? There was a time we accidentally dropped a nuclear weapon on Arkansas?
Goldsboro, North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Yep. So the United States calls, when they lose a nuclear weapon, a broken arrow incident, because it sounds a lot better than, oh no, we lost a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, than what you just said. Yes,
right.
Yeah.
So I wasn't prepared to tell the story. I should have looked it up. I'm sorry. But essentially, a nuclear weapon was lost off of an air-launched nuclear weapon, so it fell off a plane. The majority of the safety switches failed. So I want to say like 2 or 3 of the 7 or 8 safety switches failed. And we just very narrowly avoided blowing up North Carolina.
Wow, that is that is terrifying. There's sort of this belief that we have enough redundancies and protections that accidents aren't going to happen at this level. Which you know about what's happened in nuclear power plants because of earthquakes or because of technical problems or human error, and the consequences for those assumptions being wrong are tremendously high. Um, well, I didn't know that. Okay, so on your website, you have this great little list of demands, ideas, suggestions, pursuits that you have. There's five of them. One of those is to end sole authority, and this is the idea that no single person should have the ability to make the decision to launch nuclear weapons. Ending sole authority feels like something people could rally around, and I'm all for it. But I actually worry about, well, what's the alternative? That a group of people are going to make this decision? Because I mean, I know how the military is, and groupthink can become just as powerful, in fact, more reinforcing than an individual that has to stand out. Um, what is the suggestion if it's not that the president of the United States decides? Who then does decide this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think our primary focus is that first bullet point, right? Passing no first use. And so to me, if we can pass no first use, that makes that question a little bit easier, right? Because the idea behind a policy of no first use is basically, if we are saying that our nuclear weapons are for deterrent purposes only, we don't want to use them, we're not going to use them unless you use them on us first, let's make that the real policy. Let's make it the policy that we can't launch a nuclear weapon unless we have confirmed that another nation has used one against us. And there are a lot of things that we can do to make that policy more credible to our allies and everyone across the planet. We can take our weapons off of hair trigger alert. We can have less than 5,000 of them. We have the second largest arsenal on the planet right now. We could stop building new ones. So if we were able to pass a policy of no first use, not only would it put that really critical check on the launch process, it would also signal to the rest of the world that the United States, the only country who has ever aggressively used a nuclear weapon, is taking this really important step. And we wouldn't even be the first country to have a policy of no first use. There are two others. China and India both have a policy of no first use as well.
You raise this important issue of the United States as the country that has used nuclear weapons in the past, and it's we just passed the anniversary, the 76th anniversary, on August 6th and August 9th. And this information I was reminded is on your website. Reminded of the dates because it's on your website. The 76th anniversary of the United States using nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, days apart. To test two different kinds of nuclear weapons that were clearly used on civilians at a time when some would argue the war was already decided. There's a tragic history to the one time that a country in military battle for an advantage used nuclear weapons, and that was the United States. How much do you think the fact that we in this country have not reconciled ourselves to what we did in the killing of 100,000 plus people in each city, that that is something we have never really dealt with the moral implications of? Do you think that continues to roil the commitment to nuclear weapons, that we just have made it sort of seem fantastic because we tell ourselves that's what ended the Second World War?
Yeah, I think the historiography of Nagasaki and Hiroshima is really interesting because so much of high school education, learning about nuclear bombs, is we did this so that we could win World War II and save American lives. Yeah. Even progressive high school education, there might be a debate in the class of should we have done this or should we not have done this, but there's not. It's a fact that is glossed over. Yeah. There's I don't think that there's not an emotional reconciling of the fact that we killed so many people
Mm,
is kind of addressing that, the way that we think about the history.
mm. Yeah. Tristan, do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think that's part of the lore that we need to chase out, or that needs to be talked about if people are going to really get themselves around the corner of, because it feels to people like, well, wow, that was such a great thing that allowed us to end a world war. And now you're saying we shouldn't have that, which means you would want the war to go on. Like, this is sort of the math that people do emotionally. So when
Right.
someone starts to say, let's get rid of nuclear weapons, they're saying like, well, then let's just have more brutal war. Um,
Yeah. So something that I hear a lot from representatives and people that I talk to is that they don't want to take any option off the table.
yeah.
And it's really interesting to me because it goes back to the fact that we haven't internalized the amount of damage that these weapons are capable of. Not to mention the weapons that we used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are a fraction of the size of the ones that we have today. So we haven't, like you said, reconciled with the damage that we did to the people of Japan. We also haven't reconciled with the damage we've done to our own citizens, the people who were impacted by nuclear weapons testing, who are still impacted by waste storage. Atomic veterans are not even properly compensated, and the small amount of compensation that radiation exposure victims do have is set to sunset next year unless it's renewed. So this is just, it adds on to that growing list of things that we have to work on to provide justice around nuclear weapons. And a lot of it is not what immediately comes to mind. You don't necessarily think about the people groups that are harmed by nuclear weapons outside of Japan. And that's part of the problem. That's part of the reason, progressive folks are not taking up this call to end nuclear war. Mm-hmm. Not only do we feel like it's too big of an issue for us to deal with, like that's part of it. Sometimes it feels like these are just so monolithic and ingrained we can't do anything, which is a lie that we have to conquer. But, secondly, we don't talk about them as a current threat to the society that we want to work towards and build.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I think we still have in this country the idea that having weapons at our disposal keeps us safe. Like, that's just a narrative throughout our society, whether it's people keeping personal weapons on their, carrying them on their body, keeping them in their home, militarizing our police, putting armed military on our borders, having them with, shown weapons at the airport, to obviously, the most, you hear this phrasing all the time, the most powerful lethal force that humankind has ever known. That's supposed to make us all feel safe. And in that context is what seems like it makes it hard for someone to say, then let's limit the use ever of the most lethal weapon that we have. Once you've sort of built to this idea of militarization is what keeps us safe, it seems just logical that you would want the most deadly and most catastrophic weapon that you could have. So fundamentally, can we get there without a conversation about the militarization and what, in some of the theological circles, people call the myth of redemptive violence, that that there's this story that says the use of violence is what's going to finally redeem us and make us whole and keep us safe, or at least the threat of it. Can we get there without demilitarization of our society?
It's a complicated question, and I see in the chat Jim made a great point about all of the companies who make so much money on these weapons too. I think, there's a way, at the end of the day, this is all about the value of security, right? And it's how we achieve feeling secure, how we, define what security is. And I think we really need to have a conversation in America about what we consider security. I think the Black Lives Matter protests last year played a huge part in that too. Our police force doesn't necessarily make us feel secure. And I say that as a white person who doesn't necessarily have as much of a reason to be concerned about that. But if our police force, who we pour billions of dollars into, doesn't make us feel secure, our military, frankly, I don't feel more secure by trying to play the global police force. I think it really just comes down to we need to have a conversation about how we feel secure
Mm-hmm.
and what we can do as a nation to actually like shift our priorities to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. So in some ways, if people want to be involved with you, is the work that you're doing broader than just limiting this most deadly form of weapon? Or is Beyond the Bomb saying, yeah, sure, there's a larger consequence, but we're really talking about taking this one piece of that larger conversation seriously and trying to work here? Like, what's when people go to the beyondthebomb.org website and they sign up and they make their donation and get their email list, get name on the email list, all the things that we hope they're going to do after listening to this. What are they going to ultimately? Is this like, hey, if you're into working on demilitarization, we're your people? Or hey, if you're into demilitarization, keep going, we're the people working on this particular threat that we see to the well-being of this planet?
So I'm going to pass it to Calvin in just a second because I think Calvin has been with us since the beginning of this year, I think. Yeah, so I think your perspective is super interesting on this one. But
yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think probably organizationally, Beyond the Bomb is interested specifically in bombs. I think for myself, and probably an experience that everybody else working in Beyond the Bomb has, is there's almost an acceptance of our vulnerability in the face of this issue. There's something kind of apocalyptic about it. There's some violent. There's something really kind of scary about nuclear bombs and the end of the world in general. That I think when you start working on this issue, you have to consider, and you have to really kind of embrace as a reality, and drop the mirage of security that bombs or police or overpowering your enemy gives you, and accept that I could do all this work and the bomb could still drop.
Yeah.
I will say that's, I think, part of the reason if you've looked at our website, we focus so much on really hopeful messaging and trying to give people that agency to cause change. But as far as whether or not, like, are we just the bomb people?
Yeah.
So we call our volunteers the bomb squad. But
yeah, I saw that.
One of our biggest tenets is like, we don't need you to go out and start a club for Beyond the Bomb. It'd be great if you did, but we don't need you to do that. Just go out and, keep working in your community, keep organizing around all of the issues that you care about. And when there's an opportunity to take action against nuclear war or military spending or climate change, because we do work with a number of other like partner organizations and we'll boost their work too. Then, you've been working in your community and you have all of these allies that you've built in your own community that you can call on if you want to have a protest or go sit in on somebody's office or drop a banner somewhere.
So where are congressional people on this? We see in the chat, a number of people, Donna and Jen and Jim they're all naming the fact that there's so much built-in support for the military complex, especially the high cost of nuclear weapons all the way around, from producing them, researching them, keeping track of them, disposing of them. Like, it's just a very lucrative business for whole sectors of our society. And we talk about economics here a lot. So, our federal government can produce as much money as it wants for whatever it wants to produce money for. That's how a fiat system of financial government works. But if we spend money in one place, it means that we probably can't spend it in every other place because there's risk of inflation. So we can't just spend wildly. But it's not like we don't have the money for this, but should we be spending the money on this? Feels like it's the question. So yeah, there's going to be all kinds of business pressures, all kinds of militarization infrastructure spending that's going to be clamoring for this kind of money under the guise of security and war and so on. So, okay, in light of all that, where are our politicians currently on this? Like, we know that the current administration, the Biden administration, fully supportive of the full triad of options available to any president, and they're going to keep that in place, and that they're not talking at all about removing first strike capability from the presidency. But where are other people? Are there politicians that are out front on this? Are most of them staying back, staying quiet? Do people have to be convinced? What's the setting of our federal lawmakers?
It's a mixed bag. There are those politicians who have been in office and against war for their entire career. You've got people like Barbara Lee, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, who are on a lot of these bills and putting them forward. There are representatives who are doing their best to try and curb this spending through bills. Right now, there's one it's called the ICBM Act, and it would divert the money away from modernizing our ground-based strategic defense system. There's evidence at this point that Congress is willing to listen to Biden and his nuclear posture review. The Senate just came back and said that they will only fund the new sea-launched cruise missiles if Biden calls them necessary. And, they were retired under Obama. So one would hope that Biden sees that smoke signal and doesn't call for them, because that's a really easy way to make good on his campaign promises. To lower our reliance on nuclear weapons, to lower our spending on nuclear weapons.
Should we feel good if we go from 5,000 nuclear weapons to 2,500 nuclear weapons? It feels like the number is just a little arbitrary. When I don't know if they still talk in these terms, but back when, in the 80s and 90s, when these issues were more around my world, I was paying attention to them, they would talk about the number of times that the world could be destroyed by the nuclear weapons we have. Like, we could destroy human life on the face of this planet 7 times over, or something like this. So it feels like this, like is that a meaningful thing? Should we take good solace in the fact that reducing the number of nuclear weapons should be a win? Or is it like, look, it's like getting punched 11 times instead of getting punched 20 times. It's still a bad thing to get punched 11 times. Or is it like, no, this is significant accomplishment and makes a meaningful change to not renew weaponry or add any more to it, like sort of freezing the number where it is now and trying to reduce it?
I think there was a report that came out, I forgot how long ago, but it said that basically if there was a small to mid-sized nuclear war between India and Pakistan, where I think maybe the number was like 1 to 50 nuclear bombs were exchanged, it would put the entire world into an ice age for, I think, a decade. So that means widespread famine. That means millions of refugees, just a complete overhaul of the way that the world works. And that's 1 to 50.
Right.
So I think it maybe, halving our nuclear arsenal is, I'm not going to say that that's a bad policy position, but I do think that if we're being honest with ourselves, one of these weapons creates a mass issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's all about moving towards the right direction at this point. Unfortunately, we are, for the first time since Reagan, starting to increase our nuclear weapons arsenal again. So that's a big turnabout. Since it's been a long time since we've started.
That was a Trump thing. That was a Trump administration thing. Just put all that spending into nuclear weapons.
Yep. So he brought back sea-launched cruise missiles. He wanted low-yield nuclear weapons, and luckily we canceled new low-yield nuclear weapons. But I think for us, we want to pass no first use, not because we think it's going to be the end of our work. we want to pass no first use because we need people to start having a conversation about how we're going to fix this system. And unfortunately, I can't walk into a Republican senator's office and say, look, I'm here because I want to get rid of all of the nuclear weapons. But I can walk in and say, I want to have a conversation about who has authority over our nuclear weapons and about spending and responsible spending. And they're a little bit more open to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. And this is the hard work in any activism, right? Is like, what can you get versus what should the ultimate goal be? It's always a difficult thing to know, how much we can lean in. I like that on your website. One of the outcomes and goals that you're looking for is a day when nuclear weapons are forever consigned to the dustbin of history. Like, we have decided in this country that there are some weapons, and in the world, we've decided there's some weapons that are banned. You can't use them. You can't use certain chemical weapons. You can't use certain fire weapons. Like, there's just things you can't use. We haven't done that with nuclear weapons. And so it's not as if we've said, hey, you have to have every death-bringing tool at your disposal. In fact, we've said human ingenuity and technology can create all kinds of ways to kill people and destroy planets and win wars. Some of them we're not using. There's a whole lot of things we won't do. We have agreements with countries about what wars are going to look like. The fact that nuclear weapons are not a part of any of those negotiations, that's a choice. And that's a choice that doesn't even limit that the United States wouldn't be at a disadvantage militarily, right? Which is the big argument, right? The big argument is, if we say we don't have first use and Russia or some other country, Pakistan or India, says, well, we keep first use, that's a perceived strength then that those countries have over the United States. Right. And so people say, like, well, no, we're not going to, as long as we're having a proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world, we're certainly not going to, tie our options back. Getting rid of them altogether in some international agreements that, hey, I would love for a president, a congressperson, activist groups start to say, we'd love to see a movement where we say nuclear weapons are no longer considered a reasonable choice for countries to develop. That would, think about all the problems that would solve in North Korea and Iran and all the worries we have and all the other stuff we do around the world to make sure people don't get nuclear weapons. All because the United States says, well, we're keeping ours. We just don't want anyone else to have nuclear weapons. That is just so inconsistent and seems to be what's driving. This is how you get into the big boys club as a country, right, is that you've established nuclear weapons.
Right. And right now there is an international movement to make nuclear weapons illegal. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear War was ratified by the UN earlier this year, I believe. Is definitely very recent. The unfortunate thing is that no nuclear armed countries signed on to that treaty, and they're not bound by it, regrettably. So, I do think it's still really important that we're setting a global norm at this point, right? Kind of like what you were saying, we haven't been discussing how nuclear weapons are used in war. So at least now at this point, we have so many other nations coming together to say, look, we don't think you should have these weapons. We would like you to get rid of them. We've all signed on to this treaty to say that we won't have them. So, Beyond the Bomb doesn't campaign around the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons because, like I've said, we're not at a place where we can talk about getting rid of them completely yet, unfortunately. But we want to get people talking about how we can start to make this system a little bit less of a disaster waiting to happen, I guess. Mm-hmm.
So Tristan, I'm gonna want you to say a few more words about that, right? Because I think it's interesting not only to this issue, but to the broader work that people do as activists. And that is, are you saying that if you begin with the demand, we want to eliminate nuclear weapons from the global landscape, that's such a non-starter for people that are in positions that you're trying to influence, that you're not taken seriously if you start there, that you have to start at another place to accomplish something, because the rules of the game are set already where people who come in saying that, we don't take you seriously. Is that what's going on?
I mean, you're calling me out on my pragmatism here, but I think it really depends on your audience. It depends on your audience, because when I go and I talk to high schoolers, I talk about the future that I want to see where nuclear weapons are consigned to the dustbin of history.
Yes.
When I go to talk to Calvin's senator, we're talking about how if Hillary Clinton was elected, we wouldn't want her to launch a nuke, would we? It's a little bit about your audience. And I think you can remain true to your values and what you're working towards and still you can still meet someone where they're at in an attempt to move them closer to your cause. Most of the time. I'm not talking
and look,
about
I think that's really helpful. I think this is what we all need to talk about when we do our work, right? Like, well, how do you actually do it and get it done? What's the mechanism by which you're going to influence these these efforts? And I think you're right. I think it's fair to say, look, as I don't know what the organization views, but that a person can say, I want us not to have any. I'm sure you're not there quite yet, but I think we could work toward a better way of dealing with the ones we have while we make decisions about if we're going to have any or not. But this is hard because keeping your audience engaged is part of what activists have to do, whether that's the citizen audience or decision makers or industry. This is what makes it hard. And for all of us who are like idealists, and most activists start with an idea that they want to become reality in the world, idealism pretty soon runs into these other issues. George Falco on the thread says something interesting. He says, look, in his view, the world has come to a stalemate on nuclear weapons. Nobody's going to use them. That's agreed on, in the subtext. Biological weapons, on the other hand, now those things could get out of hand in a hurry, and we should be talking about that kind of thing. I know that's not what Beyond the Bomb is doing, but do you have thoughts about that as well? That, boy, there's a lot of other weapons out there that we've got to be concerned about, and that once you start into this kind of work, you're going to start thinking about how countries are deciding to kill each other, which is a really horrible and dark thing for someone to spend their time thinking about, but it's also one of the realities of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly.
Oh, go ahead.
I think there's certainly an argument to be made that, I am not one to say like we should be spending more money on combating this other threat, but I do think that there is an argument to be made that the mythology of nuclear weapons and the kind of power of owning them that it gives a country is eventually going to leave us unprepared for threats like COVID-19, which I realize is not the kind of biological weapon that we were talking about, but the CDC was underfunded, whereas nuclear weapons are constantly overfunded. But, it leaves us open to things like biological and cyber threats.
Yeah.
Going back to whether or not they'll ever be used, I think there's still the question of mistake and miscalculation that hangs over our head, because human beings are infallible. And, let's say we had a cyber threat that caused us to believe that we were facing an incoming nuclear strike, and we launched a retaliatory strike because we don't have a policy of no first use. Then all of a sudden the United States has started a nuclear war because we didn't confirm an actual nuclear strike. We responded. Because the way our system is set up, we have to respond. We can't wait and see.
Yeah. There's this countdown to midnight that nuclear scientists put together back in the 50s, came out of Einstein's thinking. And the current, I looked up at the start here, and the current setting of the clock is 100 seconds to midnight. So it's, just over a minute and a half. And they sort of look at a whole lot of issues around the world with the idea of midnight being when a country or the United States would use nuclear weapons and would create the kind of situation Calvin was describing earlier. That the planet's just unrecoverable for human inhabitation if we start into nuclear weapons at the level that they exist now. So that's a number that it's always somewhere around there, right? I think it's gotten up. I can't remember how close it got, but maybe like a few seconds to midnight. Is that right? There were times where, I don't know if you guys know this, but it seems like 100 seconds from the Science and Security Board Bulletin of Atomic Scientists seems like we're in pretty safe territory. Do you feel that? Do you feel like, okay, this is a good time to work on this because we're not pressed up against a time when we feel like nuclear weapons are more important? Or do you think, yeah, that's not really a factor we're we're calculating in here.
I actually
I think
go ahead.
Well, I think personally, any moment in time is too close, right? Like, why is it that we accept the notion that like it's okay for us to be even 100 seconds away from midnight? Like, that's not normal, and for the majority of human history, like this has not been something that people have had to deal with, and I don't understand. Like, there shouldn't be like that doesn't give me a sense of security that we're 100 seconds away as opposed to maybe 30 seconds.
Well, I actually just looked it up too. 100 seconds is the closest they have ever set the clock since their inception in 1947. And no offense to my friends at the Bulletin, I personally think 100 seconds to midnight sounds like a cool band name and maybe is not inspiring the fear in people. It should.
So 100 seconds is the closest. There was never 4 or 6 seconds like I'd made up in my brain.
It looks like
time, none of that. Okay.
It has been.
So it's up there. Yeah, and look, I that's a good point, that maybe it doesn't instill the fear that we need.
But I don't think we necessarily need fear, right? I think we need hope that we can do something about this, because fear has kept us paralyzed for 76 years. Maybe not paralyzed. There's been a lot of work of activists to fight against this, but that fear that this is such a big problem we can't do anything about it isn't helpful. It's not going to get us in the streets and working towards fixing this. So
yeah, I wonder. Who knows what motivates the human spirit? I want to be one of those people that thinks hope, love, passion drives people to do the right things in the world and not fear, destruction, and separation. I don't know. I wonder. But I have friends who've been arrested and put in jail for going to nuclear military bases, climbing over fences, and banging on nuclear weapons with a wrench, as a protest action. And they've been arrested, and they are willing to offer their the consequences of that to raise that kind of awareness. That was a thing. There were a lot of activist groups, religious groups doing anti-nuclear war, anti-nuclear weapon things. It feels like that's a generation or two ago. I'm a 54-year-old man, an old guy, and some of these people are older than I am. So it's just feels like, the urgency you're talking about, and if the group of atomic scientists are putting this thing at the closest to midnight that it's ever been, and people are still like, why are we talking about this? That really does say that the malaise has settled in over our comfortability with nuclear weapons. And maybe it's going to take some national efforts. I mean, Beyond the Bomb is self-described as a grassroots movement, and maybe it's going to need to recruit some people into some more start saying to candidates who are running for office where this matters, hey, we'd like for you to take a position on removing first strike, removing the need for it, and removing the option of it from the global stage.
So that's something that we actually do every election cycle. We target every single House and Senate candidate, no matter their party, and ask them to endorse no first use. And that's how I started at Beyond the Bomb in 2018, was doing that project. And I think I had 75 endorsements by election night. And what was really cool for me to see is this year, or I guess last year when we did it, we had over 100, somewhere between 125 and 150. And just, to me, that means that at the very least, more politicians are willing to make a statement about these weapons.
How did those break out? How did those break out party-wise and region of the country? Do you have a general sense of that?
Yeah, so largely, unsurprisingly, Democratic. We always get a lot of independents and libertarian candidates as well, and we had, I want to say, between like 10 and 15 Republican endorsements, and unfortunately, none of them won their seat. But just the fact that more people are willing to say something.
None of the Republicans, or none of the signers on overall?
None of the Republicans.
The Republicans.
None of the
So,
Republicans.
so as far as you know, no current elected Republicans in the House of Representatives or in the Senate has signed on to a statement of no first use.
There was one. He passed
Uh-huh.
away, unfortunately.
Uh-huh.
But there was a Republican representative, I want to say from North Carolina,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
co-sponsored no first use in the last session. And like I said, he did pass away. But, you know, we're working on it. We're working on it. And that's why we need the bomb squad. So if you
So
have
here's
been
the thing. A
listening,
lot of people listen to this
yeah,
and follow this. They live in areas where they're represented by a Republican in Congress and maybe even in the Senate, in the House and maybe even in the Senate. And they are like, I don't know, I live in a red state or I live in a red district. They're still your congressperson. You can still go to them and say to them, hey, you represent me and I'm speaking up. And you don't have to bring up the fact that you might tend to not vote for them. When they win, they are your representative and they're as responsible to you as they are to anyone who voted for them or didn't vote at all. So this
and
is a good
you will be
reminder that we should
surprised.
go to those people and say, will you be a standout, or are you just going to go along like a sheep with all the rest of them? I mean, one of the great things to do is to call Republicans to, a little strength, a little independence, and some leadership. That might be the kind of thing that turns the crank.
Yeah, I think, Calvin's actually spoken to staff members for both of his senators. And I think, you and I were both surprised by a positive,
Yeah.
honestly, kind of a positive reaction.
Yeah, well, and I think that there's something interesting organizing in this space in particular, where we do have the opportunity to kind of speak to conservatives and Republicans using their own language. Because if they say that they actually want smaller government, then why wouldn't they cut the budget of why wouldn't they cut the budget of something that we spend so much money on? And kind of organizing and thinking about it in that way, I think, gives an opportunity to really kind of meet them where they are.
I will say, if you want to learn more about what we do and how you can get involved with us, Calvin is going to be on our monthly organizer call at the end of this month. You can sign up for that on our website, but we do have a quick 30-minute call at the end of the month. And I think September 1st as well is where this one falls, where we kind of discuss what's going on and how you can get involved. And we keep them 30 minutes because we know that everyone's busy and we want to get, as much information to you as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Good for you. People should be sure, and then get on your email list, go to beyondthebomb.org and sign up and get on the appropriately named bomb squad to, dismantle these bombs. What businesses are most profiting from the nuclear weapon industry? Do you know which companies are tied in deeply to that?
Well, obviously there's the Iron Triangle, but you can go to Don't Bank on the Bomb. I want to say don'tbankonthebomb.org. And they have a great list. They're a partner organization. They have a great list. I was surprised to see that PNC Bank invests in nuclear weapons. So, there's ways we can divest in our daily lives. But yeah, definitely, folks like Northrop Grumman just received a sole source contract for billions of dollars to build the intercontinental ballistic missile modernization. We call it the iron. Well, I guess we don't. The term is the Iron Triangle, where defense contractors will give representatives large campaign donations. They'll make sure that they get their contracts that way. Once people retire, they go to be lobbyists, and it all kind of circles around. So the only people that are really not benefiting are us at the everyday level.
Yeah. And again, I think there's a lot of people who sadly believe they sleep better at night because they think that having a weapon is like having a shield. And again, this goes back to people that have guns or learn self-defense training or whatever. Like that, the belief is that if I have a lethal capacity available to me, that's an act of protection, and I want to be protected. There's just something in our, maybe they're right. I don't know, that none of that feels right to me. I don't think that's how it works. I think a lot of people who are killed with guns are killed while having a gun. And it doesn't protect you, unless the bullet strikes your gun, it doesn't keep you from. So having a nuclear weapon doesn't keep us safer it in any way that I think could be tested out or used. But as long as that's the case, as long as people believe that, they're just going to think like, don't divest, don't leave any of that stuff. Like make sure that all the systems you've raised about, like make sure that there's not an accident, make sure that there's only good people who can make these decisions, and we don't have bad people making these decisions, because then you have to have a world of good and bad people. And I've known too many people to buy the whole there's good people and bad people. That doesn't really hold together. So boy, there's a lot of work to be done in the psyche of this nation, in addition to the work of the rest of this. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, well, I can't work for Beyond the Bomb, or I could maybe get on the email list in the Bomb Squad, you can start talking it up with people you know and friends you know, and raising these issues, and see if this is something that even some grassroots energy could become interested in. And who knows, in 15 or 20 years, we may have a whole lot of candidates who were influenced 20 years back to think differently about nuclear weapons. And that's why the world has changed. Sometimes these issues take decades to make the ramifications of their change apparent.
Well, thank you so much for having us on. I really hope we see some new members of the Bomb Squad. If nothing else,
so.
You've spent an hour listening to us. Go take 2 minutes and write your representative. It's easy. You just fill out your address and click send. People like Calvin and I already wrote the letters for you, so we've made it easy.
They'll do all the hard work for you. They just need your name and your first name and your address, and they will send it to you. Well, that's Tristan Guyette and Rob Ryerse and Calvin Ryerse. If you're a regular on the Tuesday podcast, you might think, oh, was that Rob Ryerse? No, totally different person. This is Calvin Ryerse. Thank you for being activists in this area, for bringing us here. And I'm not a big generationalist, but boy, I hope there's a lot of other people in their 20s, teens, 20s, and 30s that start caring about this issue, because is all the good work that the previous generations did on this didn't get there. So this is an issue that has to keep being carried by future generations, because we are in a long-term changing of hearts and minds on this one. All right. Well, thanks. That was sort of a dead pause there that just laid there. Fair enough.
But we have hope. We have hope for a better future.
We do have hope for a better future. I think about those, my anti-Obama friends that would say, how's that hope and change working for you? That little dig that they say all the time. And I'm like, well, it's working pretty good, because what's the alternative to hope and change? Like despair and same, you pick. I'm going to pick a little hope and a little change. I think that sounds a good idea. So Tristan, thank you. Calvin, thank you. And producer Dan, thank you. And to all of you listening, we're going to be back tomorrow. We're talking with astrophysicist Paul Wallace. And I think we're talking about Pluto and Neptune. We're on this little planetary conversation set with the astrophysicist, and what knowing about the other planets tell us about how we should live on this one. So that's 10 o'clock Central Time. You can figure out your own time zone from there. Right, and wherever you're listening to this, you can listen to that at 10 a.m. Central Time with astrophysicist, pastor, and Professor Paul Wallace tomorrow. So Tristan, Calvin, thanks, and all the rest of you. We will see you tomorrow.